My name is Frank Mitchell. This happened to me back in 1979, a story I wish I could forget, but no, I never will. I was 48 then, running my small hunting supply store in Lower Michigan, raising my 2 kids alone since their mom passed away 5 years ago. That winter started like any other. The snow was heavy, the days were short, and my little store was doing okay. But everything changed the day I got those test results. Cancer, stage 4. The doctor gave me maybe 6 months. I remember sitting in my truck afterward, watching the snow fall, thinking about my kids, Alice, my strong-headed 17-year-old daughter who was just like her mother, and Peter, my quiet 15-year-old boy who spent more time with his books than his friends. I couldn't tell them. How do you tell your children you are dying? Instead, I decided to give them one last memory, a hunting trip up in the Upper Peninsula, just like we used to do when they were little and their mom was still alive. I had our old Winnebago Brave fixed up, new heater, better tires, the works. The kids weren't too excited at first. Alice had her school stuff, and Peter was never much for hunting. But somehow, I convinced them. Just one last family trip, I said, trying to hide how much that word last really meant. I didn't know then that I was driving my children into something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting in those frozen woods for hundreds of years. If I had known what was going to happen in those next few days, I would have never turned that key in the ignition, never driven north into that blizzard, never. But I guess you'll want to hear the whole story. And trust me, every word of what I am about to tell you is true. Though sometimes late at night, I still pray that it wasn't. We started our trip on a cold December morning. The sky was gray, and snow was falling softly as we drove north. Alice sat in the front with me, fiddling with the radio, while Peter was in the back, his nose buried in a book as usual. As we got further north, the weather got worse. The snow was coming down harder, and the wind was picking up. I had to slow down, squinting to see the road ahead. "Maybe we should turn back, Dad," Alice said, worry in her voice. "We'll be fine," I assured her, even though I was starting to have doubts myself. We stopped at a small shop near the edge of the wilderness to stock up on supplies. An old Native American man ran the place. As I was paying, he looked at me with serious eyes. "Be careful up there," he said, his voice low. "The old hunting grounds. They're not safe this time of year." I nodded politely, but didn't think much of it. I'd been hunting these woods for years. What could be so dangerous? As we drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The snow was so thick now, it was like driving through a white tunnel. That's when we saw it. Right in the middle of the road was a moose. But something was wrong. Its body was torn apart, and it was completely frozen solid. The strangest part? The blood around it was frozen too, like red icicles. "What could do that?" Peter whispered, finally looking up from his book. I didn't have an answer. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. As we carefully drove around the frozen moose, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dark woods. The temperature gauge on the dashboard kept dropping. -20 day U4F, -30 day U4F, -40 day U4F. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't be this cold. As night fell, we found a clearing to park the Winnebago. The wind howled outside, rocking our little home on wheels. None of us said it, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. What had we gotten ourselves into? That first night, none of us slept well. The wind kept making these strange noises, not like normal wind, but like someone crying from far away. Around midnight, Alice shook me awake. "Dad, did you hear that?" she whispered. I sat up, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the wind. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like someone calling out, but the voice. It sounded exactly like Sarah, my late wife. "Mom," Peter said, now awake too. "That's impossible," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's just the wind playing tricks on us." But we all knew it wasn't the wind. The temperature inside the Winnebago kept dropping, even though the heater was on full blast. Our breath came out in white puffs. The windows were starting to freeze from the inside. Then we saw it. Through the frosted window, a shadow passed by. It was huge, much taller than any person or animal I'd ever seen. As it moved, the snow seemed to swirl around it like a small blizzard. "Everyone stay quiet," I whispered, reaching for my rifle. The shadow stopped right outside our window. For a moment, everything was silent. Then we heard a sound, like ice cracking, but deeper, almost like bones breaking. Alice grabbed my arm. "Look," she mouthed, pointing to the window. Where the creature's hand touched the Winnebago, ice crystals were spreading across the metal, making it creak and groan. We sat there, frozen in fear, barely breathing, until the shadow finally moved away. But before it left, it turned, and I swear I saw antlers, not normal ones, but ones that looked like they were made of something white and gleaming, like bones. When morning came, we found huge footprints in the snow around the Winnebago. But that wasn't the worst part. About 50 feet from our camp, we found something that made my heart stop. A body, completely frozen, wearing clothes that looked like they were from the 1950s. The man's face was frozen in a look of pure terror. That's when I knew we had to get out of there. But when I tried to start the Winnebago, the engine just clicked. We were trapped. We needed firewood to stay warm since the Winnebago's heater wasn't enough anymore. Alice volunteered to gather some from nearby. "I'll be quick, Dad. Just around those trees there," she said, pointing to a cluster of pines about 30 feet away. "Take this," I said, handing her my flashlight and a whistle. 3 short blasts if you need help." She nodded and headed out. Peter and I watched from the window as she gathered sticks, her red jacket bright against the snow. Everything seemed fine until she went behind those trees. Then we heard the whistle, 3 frantic blasts. I grabbed my rifle and ran out, Peter right behind me. The cold hit me like a punch to the face. "Alice!" I shouted, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the snow. We found her tracks leading behind the trees, but they stopped suddenly. There were other tracks too, those massive ones from last night, and signs of a struggle in the snow. For 2 hours we searched. My lungs burned from shouting her name. Just as I was about to lose hope, we heard movement. Alice walked out of the woods. But something was different. Her movements were jerky, like she was too cold to walk properly. When she got closer, I noticed her lips were blue, but she wasn't shivering. She just stared at us with eyes that seemed darker than before. "I am fine," she said, but her voice sounded wrong, deeper, older somehow. "Just got a little lost." Back in the Winnebago, she wouldn't eat the soup we heated up. Instead, she kept staring at the frozen meat we had packed for the trip. Later, I caught her eating it raw in the middle of the night, mumbling words in a language I'd never heard before. Peter found something while we were searching for Alice, an old leather bag tucked into a hollow tree. Inside was a journal, its pages yellow with age. It belonged to a trapper from 1922, and what I read made my hand shake. The last entry said, "It takes them one by one, changes them. The cold gets in their blood. God help me. I can see it happening to my Mary. Her eyes. Those aren't my daughter's eyes anymore." I looked at Alice, curled up in her sleeping bag. She turned and stared back at me, and in the dim light, I saw what the trapper meant. Those weren't my daughter's eyes anymore. The next morning, things got worse. A park ranger named Mike showed up in his truck, saying he'd spotted our Winnebago and came to check if we were okay. I wanted to warn him, tell him to leave, but Alice got to him first. I'll never forget what happened next. One minute, Mike was standing there talking about radio signals and rescue teams. The next, Alice, or whatever Alice had become, moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. Her hands were like ice, literally glowing with cold. When she touched Mike, frost spread across his uniform. He didn't even have time to scream. Peter and I watched in horror as our Alice, my little girl, transformed. She grew taller, her skin turning pale as snow. Ice crystals formed on her hair, and her fingers lengthened into sharp, icy claws. When she turned to look at us, small antlers of crystallized bone were starting to grow from her head. "Run!" I yelled to Peter, pushing him toward the ranger's truck. The keys were still in it, but Peter didn't run. Instead, he pulled out the trapper's journal. "Dad, I know how to save her," he shouted. "The journal talks about a ritual. Someone with the same blood has to." He never finished that sentence. Alice, the thing that used to be Alice, lunged at us. But then something even bigger appeared behind her. It was the master Wendigo, the one we'd seen that first night. It was enormous, its body made of ancient ice, with massive antlers made of what looked like frozen human bones. Peter started chanting something from the journal, words I didn't understand. Alice stopped moving, caught between us and the master Wendigo. She looked confused, like she was fighting something inside her. "The ritual needs a sacrifice," Peter said quietly. "Someone of the same blood. It has to be willing." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Take care of Alice, Dad." Before I could stop him, Peter ran forward, still chanting, and grabbed both Alice and the master Wendigo. There was a flash of blue light and the sound of ice cracking. The cold was so intense it felt like my skin was burning. When I could see again, Peter was gone. The master Wendigo had disappeared too. Alice lay in the snow, normal size again, but her hair had turned completely white, and when she opened her eyes, they were ice blue. I wish I could say the story ended there, but it didn't. You see, I died 3 months later from my cancer, but I lived long enough to see what the curse had done. Alice survived, but she was marked forever. She never felt cold again, and every winter she had to fight the urges that came with the curse. She went on to have children of her own, and every one of them was born with that same white hair and ice blue eyes. They say on cold winter nights, when the wind howls just right, they can hear their Uncle Peter's voice in the storm, still protecting them from what lurks in the frozen dark. I am telling this story now as a warning. If you are ever in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in winter, and the temperature drops way too fast, or if you hear voices in the wind that sound like loved ones calling, don't answer. Just run. Run as fast as you can. Because some sacrifices leave marks that last forever, and some curses never really end. My name is Elizabeth Morgan, and what I am about to tell you happened to me in the winter of 1965. I still get chills thinking about those 5 days in the Minnesota wilderness, days that changed my life forever and took away almost everyone I loved. I was just 23 then, newly married to David. We were so in love and full of dreams. David was this tall, handsome guy with the kindest brown eyes you'd ever seen. He worked as a high school teacher, and I was a nurse at the local hospital. We'd been married for only 3 months when our friends suggested this hunting trip. The plan seemed perfect at first. 3 couples in a converted school bus, heading to a remote lake for some hunting and camping. There was us, then Robert and Mary Thompson, who'd been our friends since college. Robert was always the funny one, always cracking jokes, while Mary had this gentle way about her. She was trying to have a baby back then. The oldest couple was John and Patricia Williams. John was this big, tough ex-Marine who knew everything about hunting. Patricia was like everybody's favorite aunt, always baking cookies and telling stories. They'd been married for 15 years and went hunting every season. We took Robert's converted school bus, this huge blue thing that he'd turned into the coolest RV you've ever seen. It had bunk beds, a tiny kitchen, and even a small bathroom. We were all so excited when we set out that morning, singing songs, sharing snacks, and talking about the adventures ahead. If only we'd known what was waiting for us in those woods. If only we'd turned back when we saw those first strange signs, but we didn't. And now, as I sit here telling this story, I have to live with those memories, and something far worse. That first day started out just fine. We were following this old dirt road that John said was once used by logging trucks. The trees were getting thicker, and the road was getting bumpier. Robert kept joking about how his luxury bus wasn't made for this kind of terrain. Around 4 p.m., things started feeling different. The temperature dropped so quickly that we could see our breath inside the bus. Mary noticed it first, saying, "Guys, is it supposed to be this cold? The weather report said it would be mild today." John checked his thermometer. "It's 20 degrees colder than it should be," he said, frowning. "That's not normal." That's when we found the campsite. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. There was still a half-eaten sandwich on a paper plate, and clothes were scattered around. But what made my stomach turn was the deer. It was lying there, half-eaten, but not in the way animals usually eat their prey. The cuts were different. Too clean in some places, too ragged in others. "Look up there," David whispered, pointing at the trees. We all looked up and saw these strange things hanging from the branches, little figures made of bones tied together with what looked like hair. They swayed in the wind, making this soft clicking sound that made my skin crawl. Patricia grabbed John's arm. "We should go," she said quietly. "This doesn't feel right." But John, being the experienced hunter he was, wanted to investigate. "Someone might be in trouble," he said. "We should at least look around." That's when we heard it, a sound I'll never forget. It was like someone crying, but not quite human. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Robert tried to lighten the mood. "Probably just the wind playing tricks," he said, but his voice was shaking. We all knew it wasn't the wind. The sun was setting fast, and the temperature kept dropping. Our breath was coming out in thick white clouds now, and frost was starting to form on the bus windows. On the inside, it wasn't natural. Nothing about this was natural. "We'll stay in the bus tonight," John decided. "All of us, together. First light tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do." None of us argued. We parked the bus in a small clearing, trying to ignore those bone things clicking in the trees. If we'd known what was coming, we would have turned that bus around and driven straight back to civilization, no matter how dark it was getting. But we didn't. We stayed, and that was our first mistake of many. None of us could sleep that night. We kept hearing things, terrible things. Around midnight, Patricia said she heard someone calling her name from the woods. It sounded exactly like her sister's voice, but that was impossible. Her sister lived in Florida. "Did anyone else hear that?" Patricia whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched her coffee mug. We all nodded. Each of us had been hearing voices, voices we knew couldn't be real. I heard my mom calling me, begging for help. David said he heard his little brother laughing. Then we saw it for the first time. I was looking out the bus window when the moonlight caught something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just a really tall person. But people aren't 15 feet tall. People don't have bodies that look like they haven't eaten in years. And people definitely don't have deer skulls for heads, with huge antlers reaching up into the dark. "John," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "John, please tell me you see that too." John was already reaching for his rifle. The creature turned its head toward our bus, and I saw its eyes. They were glowing white, like 2 full moons. The air got so cold that ice started forming on all the windows. Mary started crying quietly, and Robert held her close. David grabbed my hand. His palm was sweating despite the cold. Patricia was praying under her breath. The creature just stood there, watching us. Then it opened its mouth, a mouth full of teeth that looked like icicles, and made this sound. It was like a mixture of a deer's cry and a human scream. All the windows in the bus rattled. "Nobody move," John whispered. "Nobody make a sound." We sat there, frozen in fear, for what felt like hours. The creature finally walked away, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by strings. But before it disappeared into the trees, it turned and looked right at David. Just David. And somehow, I knew right then that something terrible was going to happen to my husband. When morning came, None of us talked about what we'd seen. Maybe we thought if we didn't talk about it, it wasn't real. Patricia said she needed some air and went to gather firewood near the bus. John went with her, of course. They were only going a few feet away, just within sight. That's when everything went horribly wrong. We heard Patricia's scream first. It was sharp and sudden, then cut off in the middle, like someone had pressed a mute button. John shouted her name and ran toward where she'd been standing, just 20 feet from the bus. But she was gone. Just gone. The only things left were her gloves on the ground and some strange tracks in the snow. Not human, not animal, just wrong. "Patricia!" John kept shouting, his voice getting more desperate each time. We all spread out to search, but stayed close enough to see each other. The woods felt different in daylight, but not better. The bone things in the trees looked even creepier, and now we could see there were hundreds of them. That's when Robert spotted something red in the snow. It was Patricia's scarf, frozen solid like it had been dipped in water and left out in the cold. But it hadn't been snowing, and there wasn't any water nearby. We followed a trail of frozen items: her hat, one boot, her jacket, each piece frozen solid. The trail led us to an old fallen tree, and that's where we found her. I am a nurse, and I've seen some terrible things, but nothing like this. Patricia was partially frozen into the tree trunk, like she'd somehow been merged with it. She was still alive, barely. Her skin was blue with frost, but her eyes were open, and she was trying to say something. John fell to his knees beside her. "Baby, I am here," he whispered, touching her face. "We'll get you out." Patricia's lips moved, and we all leaned in to hear. "So hungry," she whispered. "It's so hungry." Those were her last words. Right after that, her body just shattered, like a glass statue breaking into a million pieces. John screamed, a sound I never want to hear again. He gathered up the frozen pieces of his wife in his arms, sobbing and talking nonsense. That's when David started acting strange. He was staring at Patricia's remains with this weird look in his eyes, and I saw him lick his lips. When he turned to look at me, his eyes seemed different, lighter somehow. And he whispered something that made my blood run cold. "I am hungry too, Beth, so hungry." We had to drag John back to the bus. He kept trying to go back for Patricia's remains, but Robert and David finally got him inside. He just sat there, staring at nothing, mumbling her name over and over. Something was definitely wrong with David. He kept pacing, rubbing his stomach, and looking at everyone like we were food. When Mary offered him some soup, he knocked it out of her hands and growled at her. His skin felt ice cold when I touched him, even though we had the bus heater running full blast. That afternoon, while looking for the radio in the bus storage, I found something that made everything worse: an old journal, its pages yellow and crumbly. It was dated 1890, written by a logger named Michael Hansen. As I read it, my hands started shaking. "The thing in the woods," the journal said, "it picks one of us to become like it. The hunger starts slow, then grows until there's nothing left of who they were. We lost Thomas yesterday. His skin turned white as snow, and his eyes. God help us, his eyes." I looked at David. His skin was getting paler by the hour. That night, the temperature dropped to impossible levels. Ice formed inside the bus even with the heater on. We were all huddled together for warmth, except David, who kept saying he wasn't cold at all. John had finally fallen asleep, still clutching Patricia's frozen scarf. Around midnight, Mary shook me awake. "Listen," she whispered. Outside, something was walking around the bus. The footsteps were heavy, making the snow crunch. Then we heard voices, lots of voices. They all sounded like Patricia calling for help. "John, please help me. I am so cold, John. Why did you let me die?" John woke up and grabbed his rifle. "Patricia," he called out, his voice breaking. "Baby, is that you?" "John, don't!" Robert tried to stop him. but John was already opening the bus door. That's when David started laughing. It wasn't his normal laugh. It was high and cold, like breaking ice. When he smiled at us, his teeth looked sharper, and his eyes were turning white. "He's coming," David said in a voice that wasn't his own. "He's hungry. We're all so hungry." The moment John opened that door, everything happened so fast. A blast of freezing air hit us, colder than anything I'd ever felt. The voices suddenly stopped, and in that silence we heard something much worse. The sound of antlers scraping against the bus roof. Mary screamed. The creature was right above us. Then David. Oh God, David. He stood up, his movements all wrong, like his joints were bending the wrong way. His skin had turned almost white, and when he opened his mouth, his teeth were long and sharp like icicles. "Mary," he said in this horrible voice, "you smell so good." Before anyone could move, he grabbed her. Robert tried to save her. He really did. He jumped at David with his hunting knife, but David was too strong now. He threw Robert across the bus like he weighed nothing. I heard bones crack when he hit the wall. "Run!" Robert screamed at me. "Beth, run now!" I was frozen in place, watching my husband, the man I loved, tear into Mary like she was made of paper. Her screams. I still hear them in my nightmares. John started shooting at David, but the bullets didn't seem to hurt him. They just made holes in his skin that leaked this black frozen liquid. The roof of the bus suddenly ripped open like a tin can. The big creature, the original Wendigo, reached in with its long, bony arms. Robert pushed me toward the back emergency door. "Go," he yelled. "I'll hold them off." John stepped forward then, holding something in his hand, Patricia's scarf. He started speaking in a language I didn't understand. It sounded ancient, like a prayer or a spell. "Beth," he said quickly, "the journal mentioned a ritual, a sacrifice, someone who lost their love to the Wendigo. I am the only one who can end this. Now, run." I ran. Behind me, I heard John's voice getting louder, the creature screaming. And David, my David, making sounds no human should make. The last thing I saw when I looked back was a bright blue light filling the bus, and John's voice rising to a shout that shook the trees. I ran through the dark woods, stumbling and falling in the deep snow. The freezing wind cut through my clothes like knives. Behind me, I could still hear screaming, and that awful blue light lit up the forest like lightning. I ran until my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, everything was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and heartbeat. A search party found me the next morning, half frozen under a fallen tree. They said I was lucky to be alive. When they went to look for the others, they found the bus completely frozen solid, like a giant ice cube. There were no bodies inside, just frozen blood and deep claw marks everywhere. They never found John, Robert, Mary, or David. The police said it must have been a bear attack, but I knew better. Nobody believed my story about the Wendigo. They sent me to therapy, tried to convince me it was all in my head. But 2 months later, I discovered something that proved it was all real. I was pregnant. David and I had been trying for a baby, and now I was carrying his child. At first, I was happy. A piece of my David would live on. Then the strange things started happening. During my pregnancy, the temperature would drop suddenly whenever I entered a room. Food never satisfied me. I was always hungry, no matter how much I ate. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard David's voice calling to me from the woods behind my house. When my baby was born, the doctors gasped. My little girl had stark white eyes, just like the creature in the woods. And she was always hungry, crying for food every hour. No amount of milk could satisfy her. She's 15 now, and the hunger has only gotten worse. Sometimes I catch her staring at people the way David stared at Mary that night. Last week, our neighbor's cat disappeared, and I found strange frozen claw marks on our back door. I am telling this story because I need help. My daughter is changing, just like David did, and last night I saw bone totems hanging from the trees in our backyard. The Wendigo isn't done with my family, and I am afraid, so afraid, that it's starting all over again. Just yesterday, I found her diary hidden under her bed. What I read there made my blood freeze. She wrote about hearing voices in the woods, about feeling so hungry that it hurts. She described dreams of running through snowy forests, hunting people. I am writing this now because I don't know how much time I have left. The temperatures in our house keep dropping, even though it's summer. Ice forms on her bedroom windows every night. And this morning, when I went to wake her up for school, her bed was empty. On her pillow was one of those bone totems, made from what looked like small animal bones. I can hear something moving around outside my house right now. The sound of heavy footsteps in the snow. Yes, snow, even though it's the middle of summer. There's that scraping sound on the roof again, just like that night in 1965. My daughter's voice is calling me from the woods, but I know it's not really her voice anymore. "Mom," it calls. "I am so hungry, Mom. Please come help me." The scratching at my door is getting louder. The temperature in my room has dropped so low I can see my breath. I think they're both out there, my daughter and the original Wendigo. Maybe even David too. To anyone who finds this story, if you are ever in the northern Minnesota woods and the temperature drops suddenly, if you see bone totems in the trees, or hear the voices of your loved ones calling from the forest, run. Run as fast as you can. Don't look back. Because the hunger never ends. It only spreads. The door is opening now. I can see their white eyes in the darkness. My name is James Anderson, and what I am about to tell you happened to me and my wife Elizabeth back in 1955. I still get chills thinking about those 7 days we spent in the forests of northern Wisconsin. Sometimes I wake up at night, wondering if I should share this story, but people need to know the truth about what lurks in those woods. I was 26 then, fresh out of college with a teaching degree, and Elizabeth was 23, working as a nurse at the local hospital. We were young, in love, and maybe a bit too adventurous for our own good. We met at a coffee shop in Chicago when I accidentally spilled my drink all over her new white dress. Instead of getting angry, she laughed, and that's when I knew she was special. We got married in spring of '55, and unlike other couples who dreamed of fancy hotels for their honeymoon, we had this crazy idea. We spent months converting an old yellow school bus into our dream RV. Everyone thought we were nuts. My parents, her parents, our friends. "Why can't you just go to Niagara Falls like normal people?" they'd say. But Elizabeth and I weren't exactly normal. The bus was our pride and joy. We painted it blue, built a small kitchen, added a comfortable bed, and even made a tiny bathroom. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Our plan was simple. Drive up through Wisconsin, explore the unexplored, and have an adventure we'd tell our grandkids about someday. If only we knew what kind of adventure we were really heading into. If only someone had told us what those blank spaces on the map really meant. If only we'd listened to that old man at Jerry's Diner who tried to warn us about the Devil's Forest. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. From that sunny Tuesday morning when we first drove past the "Welcome to Northern Wisconsin" sign, not knowing we were driving straight into a nightmare that would change our lives forever. Everything was perfect for the first 2 days. We drove through small towns, stopped at local diners, and spent our nights parked in peaceful campgrounds. Elizabeth would cook breakfast on our little stove, while I planned our route for the day. It felt like we were living in a dream. Then we stopped at Jerry's Diner, just outside a tiny town called Pine Creek. That's where things started to feel different. We were having coffee and pancakes when this old man with a gray beard kept staring at our map. He walked over, his hand shaking as he pointed at the blank space we'd planned to explore. "You folks heading up there?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes, sir," I smiled. "Looks like good camping ground." He leaned in closer, and I could smell coffee on his breath. Here is a reason that part of the map is empty. People go in, they don't always come out. The forest, it ain't right. Elizabeth squeezed my hand under the table, but I just laughed it off. Every small town had its scary stories, right? We should have listened. The trouble started when we turned onto an old logging road. Our bus bounced over rocks and roots, going deeper into the forest. The trees got thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. What was strange was the silence. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around, nothing. "James," Elizabeth said softly, "maybe we should turn back." But I kept driving. That was my first mistake. We found a nice clearing to park the bus. While Elizabeth set up our camping chairs, I walked around to collect firewood. That's when I saw it, the first strange mark. It looked like someone had taken a hot iron and burned a symbol into a tree trunk. It was shaped like a twisted triangle with weird lines coming out of it. I called Elizabeth over to look. She didn't like it one bit. "It feels wrong," she whispered, "like someone's watching us." I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. "It's probably just some kids messing around," I said. But deep down, something felt off. As the sun started setting, we noticed another weird thing. My watch said it was 5:30 p.m., but it looked more like 8 p.m. outside. Elizabeth's watch showed a different time altogether. That night, we heard something moving around our bus. Not like a deer or a bear. This was different. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like whatever it was wanted us to hear it. I held Elizabeth close in our small bed, telling her everything would be fine. But when morning came, we found something that made my blood run cold. A rabbit, turned inside out, but somehow still breathing. Elizabeth screamed, and I just stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How was this possible? What kind of thing could do this to an animal? That was just the beginning of our nightmare in the Devil's Forest. If only we'd turned around right then and there, maybe things would have been different. But we stayed, and what happened next? Well, that's when things got really bad. We couldn't leave right away because our bus wouldn't start. I tried everything I knew about engines, but nothing worked. It was like something was keeping us there. That afternoon, we met another couple camping nearby, Tom and Mary Wilson. They seemed nice enough, with their fancy new camping gear and friendly smiles. They were parked about 100 yards from us, and having other people around made us feel a bit safer. But that night, everything changed. I woke up around midnight to Elizabeth shaking me. "James, listen," she whispered. Outside, we could hear Mary screaming. I grabbed our flashlight and ran toward their campsite, Elizabeth right behind me. What we found still haunts me. Their tent was torn apart, camping gear scattered everywhere. But Tom and Mary were gone. Just gone. The only strange thing was a fresh symbol burned into a nearby tree, the same twisted triangle we'd seen before. But this time it seemed to be dripping. "We need to find them," I said, but Elizabeth grabbed my arm. "Look at the trees," she said, her voice shaking. I lifted my flashlight, and my heart nearly stopped. The trees around us were different. I know this sounds crazy, but I swear they had moved. The path we'd taken to get there was gone, replaced by thick, twisted trunks that seemed to lean toward us. That's when we saw it for the first time. At first, I thought it was just another tree. But trees don't move. Trees don't have long, bark-like fingers. And trees definitely don't have glowing green eyes. The thing was tall, maybe 12 feet. Its body looking like twisted bark and branches. It moved like water, flowing between the trees. When it turned to look at us, I felt my whole body go cold. We ran back to our bus, locked ourselves inside, and held each other until morning. Elizabeth had the first nightmare that night. She woke up screaming about roots growing through people's bodies and a green man who wanted to make her his forest bride. The next morning, I found an old box hidden under some leaves near our bus. Inside were newspaper clippings dating back to the 1800s, all about missing people in these woods. Some of the stories mentioned strange symbols on trees and time acting weird, just like what we were experiencing. Elizabeth started changing after that. She'd stare into the forest for hours, mumbling things that didn't make sense. Sometimes she'd draw the symbols we'd seen, over and over, not even realizing she was doing it. I tried to keep track of time, but it was impossible. Sometimes it felt like days passed in just a few hours. Other times the sun would stay in the same spot for what seemed like forever. Then we found the first body, or what was left of it. It was like the person had become part of a tree, their face frozen in a scream, branches growing right through them. Elizabeth just looked at it and said, "It's calling to me, James. The forest is calling." I knew then we had to find a way out, no matter what. But the forest had other plans for us, especially for Elizabeth. And what happened next? Well, that's when I learned just how real those old legends about the Green Man really were. Elizabeth started sleepwalking that night. I woke up to find her side of the bed empty, and the bus door wide open. My heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside. "Elizabeth," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Elizabeth, where are you?" The forest seemed different at night. The trees looked like they were breathing, their branches swaying without any wind. My flashlight beam caught something moving, but it wasn't Elizabeth. It was like a piece of the forest had broken off and was walking around. I saw it split into two, then three separate shapes, all of them looking like walking trees. That's when I heard Elizabeth's voice, singing an odd tune I'd never heard before. I followed the sound, pushing through branches that seemed to grab at my clothes. I found her standing in a clearing, her white nightgown covered in dirt, drawing those symbols in the soil with a stick. "Honey," I said softly, "wake up. You need to come back to the bus." She turned to me, but her eyes, they were glowing slightly green, just like that creature's eyes. "James," she said, but her voice sounded different, older somehow. "The Green Man showed me things. He showed me what the forest really is." I took a step toward her, but suddenly the ground beneath us started moving. Roots burst from the earth, wrapping around Elizabeth's ankles. She didn't even try to fight it, she just smiled. "No!" I screamed, running to grab her, but the roots were faster. They pulled her down, and she disappeared into the earth right in front of my eyes. In panic, I started digging with my bare hands. That's when I noticed one of the trees had a doorway in it, a real doorway, glowing with a faint green light. Next to it was a fresh symbol, still smoking like it had just been burned into the bark. I knew I had two choices: run away and save myself, or follow my wife into whatever nightmare this forest had planned. There really wasn't any choice at all. I took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and stepped through the tree doorway. What I found on the other side, well, that's the part that still gives me nightmares. Because that's where I learned the true story of the Devil's Forest and why it had chosen my Elizabeth. Stepping through that tree doorway was like walking into another world. I found myself in a huge underground chamber, with roots as thick as cars hanging from the ceiling. The walls glowed with a soft green light, and the air smelled like wet earth and something rotting. That's where I saw them, all the missing people. They weren't dead, but they weren't exactly alive either. They were part of the walls, merged with the roots and trees, their faces peaceful like they were sleeping. I recognized Tom and Mary among them, roots growing through their bodies. In the center of it all was Elizabeth, floating a few feet off the ground. Roots and vines moved around her like snakes, but she didn't look scared. She looked happy. "Elizabeth," I called out, my voice echoing, "please come back to me." That's when the Green Man appeared. He came together like leaves and branches forming a body, twice as tall as me. His face was made of bark, with those glowing green eyes that seemed to look right through me. "She belongs to the forest now." His voice sounded like rustling leaves. "The forest needs a bride, a mother for its children. Your Elizabeth is special. She can hear the forest's song." "She's my wife," I said, trying to sound brave even though I was terrified. "I won't let you take her." The creature laughed, and all the roots in the chamber shook. "You humans, always thinking you have a choice. The forest has been here long before you, and it will be here long after. Elizabeth understands this now. I remembered something the old man at Jerry's diner had slipped into my pocket, a small pouch of tobacco. He'd mumbled something about it being sacred and protection against the old spirits. I'd thought he was crazy then, but now. I pulled out the pouch with shaking hands. The green man's eyes widened when he saw it. "Elizabeth," I called out again. "Remember who you are. Remember us." She blinked, and for a moment, her eyes weren't green anymore. They were her eyes, the ones I fell in love with. "James," she whispered. What happened next changed everything. The choice Elizabeth made, and what it cost us. That's the part that still keeps me awake at night. Because sometimes the most terrifying part of a nightmare isn't the monsters. It's the choices we have to make when we face them. I threw the sacred tobacco at the green man's feet and started the old prayer the diner man had taught me. The effect was instant. The creature screamed, a sound like trees breaking in a storm. The green light turned red, and the roots began to burn. "Elizabeth, we have to go now," I shouted, running toward her. The green man wasn't giving up easily. He split himself into multiple shapes, all of them reaching for us with their branch-like fingers. The chamber started shaking, roots falling from the ceiling. Elizabeth looked torn, like she was fighting something inside her. "James, I can hear it. The forest, it's crying." "That's not your home," I said, grabbing her hand. "Your home is with me." We ran through the burning chamber as everything collapsed around us. The other people trapped in the walls. I still feel guilty about leaving them behind, but there was no time to save them. We found another tree doorway, jumping through just as the underground chamber caved in. We ran all the way back to our bus, which suddenly started working again. As we drove away, we saw the forest burning in our rearview mirror. The green man's screams seemed to follow us for miles. But that's not the end of the story. 2 months later, Elizabeth started feeling sick. When we went to the doctor, he said she was pregnant. We were happy at first, until we noticed things, strange things. Small plants would grow wherever Elizabeth walked. Our garden bloomed out of season, and sometimes when she slept, I'd find small branches growing from under her pillow. When our baby was born 6 months later, yes, 6 months, not 9, his eyes would sometimes glow green in the dark. Elizabeth said she could hear the forest calling to her, even though we were hundreds of miles away. We never went back to those woods, but sometimes I think the woods came back with us. Our son is 15 now, and he can make plants grow just by touching them. Elizabeth, she's different too. Not in a bad way, but she's not entirely human anymore, and neither is our boy. The Devil's Forest didn't let us go completely, it just changed its plans. Sometimes at night, I hear Elizabeth singing those strange forest songs to our son. And when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear the green man's voice, laughing, reminding me that the forest always gets what it wants, one way or another. That's my story. Some nights I wonder if I really saved Elizabeth, or if the forest just decided to spread itself in a different way. But when I see my son growing up strong and kind, even with his differences, I tell myself we made the right choice. Just remember this. If you are ever driving through northern Wisconsin and see an empty spot on your map, turn around. Some blank spaces are meant to stay blank, and some forests are meant to keep their secrets. Because somewhere in those woods, the green man is still waiting, still searching for his next forest bride, and next time, sacred tobacco might not be enough to save you. My name is Helen Foster, and what I am about to tell you happened to me and my children in the summer of 1993. Some nights, when I hear water dripping or see shadows moving in the dark, it all comes rushing back. Every terrifying moment we spent in that Louisiana swamp. Back then, I was a 38-year-old single mom with 2 amazing 13-year-old twins, Jane and John. We were running away, yes, but I like to think of it as starting fresh. Running from their father, Tom, who had turned from the man I loved into someone I feared. The last time he raised his hand at me, I knew we had to leave. That very night, I packed whatever I could fit in our old Winnebago Warrior, woke up my sleeping children, and drove away from our home in Memphis. We had some money saved up, not much, but enough to keep us going for a while. I chose Louisiana because Tom would never think to look for us there. He always hated the heat and the mosquitoes. Plus, I had heard stories about the beautiful bayous where you could camp for free. It seemed perfect at the time, just me and my kids, living in our Winnebago, healing together. If only I had listened to that old woman at the gas station. "The swamp don't take kindly to broken families," she had said, her eyes fixed on my twins. "Especially not to special children like yours." I thought she was just being weird. You know how some small-town folks can be. But now I know she was trying to warn us about something ancient and evil that lived in those dark waters. This is our story, about how a simple escape turned into a nightmare, about a mother's love, and about things that shouldn't exist but do. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will believe me, but every word I am about to tell you is true. My children still bear the scars to prove it. We found a quiet spot to park our Winnebago near the water's edge, deep in the bayou. The air was thick and humid, making our clothes stick to our skin. The twins were excited at first. They'd never been camping before. John kept pointing at the huge trees covered in hanging moss, while Jane took pictures with the small camera I'd gotten her for their birthday. "Mom, look what I found!" John called out while I was making sandwiches for dinner. He was holding something in his hands, a small doll made of twigs and string, dripping with swamp water. My stomach turned when I saw it. The doll had dark threads wrapped around its neck, like it had been strangled. "Put that back, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably someone's craft project." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. Something felt wrong about that doll. That night, we heard the singing. It started soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. The voice was singing words I couldn't understand. Not English, maybe French or something older. Jane sat up in her bed, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that, Mom?" "It's just the wind in the trees," I said, but I didn't believe my own words. The singing got louder, and now it seemed to be coming from all around us. John started crying in his sleep, mumbling words that made no sense. I tried to start the Winnebago. Maybe we could find another spot to camp, but the engine just clicked and died. That's when we saw them, more dolls, dozens of them, floating in the water around our campsite. They moved against the current, circling our vehicle like tiny wooden sharks. The singing stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so deep it hurt my ears. Then Jane screamed. Through the window, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. The hanging moss on the trees was moving, twisting itself into a shape that looked almost human. "Mom," John whispered, his voice shaking. "Someone's watching us from the water." That was just the beginning of our first night in the bayou. If I had known what was coming next, I would have pushed that Winnebago into the swamp with my bare hands and run away with my children. But sometimes, running away isn't enough, especially when what's chasing you isn't human at all. That night seemed to last forever. None of us could sleep. We huddled together in the small living area of our Winnebago, jumping at every sound from outside. The weird thing was, the normal swamp noises, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, had all stopped. The silence felt wrong, like the whole swamp was holding its breath. Around midnight, John started acting strange. His eyes got glassy, and he kept staring at his reflection in the window. "The water is calling me," he said in a voice that didn't sound like his at all. When I touched his forehead, it was ice cold. Jane grabbed her twin brother's hand and gasped. "Mom, I can feel what he's feeling," she cried. "Something's trying to get inside his head." I wrapped them both in my arms, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. That's when the water around our Winnebago started to rise. Not like normal flooding, this was different. The dark water was moving up like someone was lifting it, creating walls of murky liquid all around us. We needed help. When morning finally came, I decided to drive to the nearest town, but the swamp had other plans. Every road we took led us back to the same spot. It was like the swamp itself didn't want us to leave. In town, we found Mama Celeste's shop, a small place filled with herbs and old bottles. The old woman took one look at my twins and her face went pale. "Your children?" she said, shaking her head. "They're special. The rougarou knows it. That's why it wants them." "What's a rougarou?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "A swamp demon," she replied. "It feeds on family bonds, on love and fear. And it's chosen your family." She looked at John, who was still acting dazed. "Your boy. It's already starting to take him." Jane squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. "Mom, we can't let it take John." Mama Celeste gave us some herbs and drew strange symbols on the twins' wrists with ash. "These will help for now," she said, "but you need to be ready. The rougarou won't stop until it gets what it wants." As we drove back to our campsite, I noticed John getting worse. He kept mumbling about voices in the water, and sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, his reflection in the mirror showed someone else's face. Back at the campsite, things got worse. The sky turned dark even though it was only afternoon. The air felt heavy, like right before a big storm. John kept walking towards the water, and I had to keep pulling him back. His skin was cold as ice, and his eyes, they weren't his anymore. They looked like muddy swamp water. Jane wouldn't leave her brother's side. "I can feel it, Mom," she whispered. "Something dark is trying to take him away from us." She held onto John's hand, and I could see both of them shaking. That's when we heard Tom's voice, my ex-husband, the twins' father. "Helen, where are you hiding my kids?" But it couldn't be him. He was hundreds of miles away in Memphis. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, the trees, the water, even the ground beneath our feet. The Spanish moss started moving again, twisting into shapes that looked like reaching hands. The water rose higher, and in it, I saw faces, so many faces. They looked like they were screaming, but no sound came out. "Mom!" Jane screamed. "John's walking into the water." I ran to grab him, but he was stronger than usual. His eyes were completely black now, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice anymore. "The water wants us all," he said in a deep, gurgling voice. "It wants our family." Jane started crying, but then something amazing happened. She raised her hands, and the water around John stopped moving. Mama Celeste's symbols on her wrists were glowing with a faint blue light. "I remember now," she said quietly. "The stories Grandma used to tell us about our real father, about the swamp magic in our blood. The truth hit me like a truck. Their real father, the man I'd met in these very swamps years ago, the one who disappeared before the twins were born. He wasn't just some traveler like he'd said. He was something else, something connected to these waters." John was halfway into the swamp now, and the water was starting to swallow him. We had to do something fast, or we were going to lose him forever. Everything happened so fast after that. The sky turned almost black, and the wind howled like 1,000 angry voices. John was chest deep in the water now, and the swamp demon, this thing made of moss and mud, was rising up behind him, twice as tall as our Winnebago. "Remember what Mama Celeste said," Jane shouted over the wind. "The demon feeds on family bonds. We have to use that against it." I ran into the water after John, not caring how cold it was or what might be lurking beneath. The water tried to push me back, but a mother's love is stronger than any demon. I reached for John's hand, and Jane grabbed his other hand. We made a circle, just like Mama Celeste told us to. "John, honey," I cried, "remember when you and Jane were little? Remember how we used to make pancakes every Sunday morning? Remember how you always made yours look like funny faces?" Jane joined in. "Remember our secret twin language, John? The one we made up when we were 6? Remember how we used it to talk about Christmas presents?" Something flickered in John's black eyes. For a moment, I saw my son in there, fighting to come back to us. But the demon wasn't giving up. The water rose higher, trying to pull us apart. The moss creature reached for John with its dripping arms. That's when Jane started glowing, actually glowing, with a soft blue light. The same light her father had in his eyes the night I met him. She squeezed her brother's hand harder and started speaking words I didn't understand. Ancient words that seemed to make the air buzz. "Mom," John suddenly gasped in his own voice, "I can't fight it much longer. It's too strong." "Yes, you can," I shouted. "We're family. We stick together, always." The demon roared, a sound like thunder and rushing water mixed together. It tried one last time to take John, but Jane's light grew brighter and brighter. John's eyes cleared, the blackness fading away. But something was wrong. The demon was shrinking, but John was getting weaker. John looked at us with tears in his eyes. "I know what I have to do," he said softly. "The demon won't stop unless someone takes its place as the swamp's guardian." "No!" Jane and I screamed together, but John just smiled, that brave, gentle smile I'd known since he was a baby. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered. "I can feel it. This is what I am meant to do, to protect you both, to protect everyone from this thing." Before we could stop him, John pulled away from us and walked deeper into the water. The demon's mossy form wrapped around him like a cocoon. Jane tried to run after him, but I held her back, somehow knowing that this was John's choice to make. There was a flash of blue light, so bright it lit up the whole swamp. When it faded, the demon was gone. Where John had stood, the water now glowed with a soft, peaceful light. We could feel him there, not gone, but changed. He had become part of the swamp, but the good part, the part that protects instead of destroys. Jane collapsed in my arms, crying. "He's not gone, Mom," she said between sobs. "I can still feel him. He's everywhere in the water now. He's keeping the demon away. He's keeping everyone safe." As if to prove her right, the water around us turned crystal clear. The oppressive feeling that had haunted the swamp lifted. Even the Spanish moss stopped its creepy dancing and hung still and peaceful from the trees. That night, as we sat in our Winnebago one last time, we heard singing again. But this time, it was beautiful, like a lullaby. It was John's voice, carried on the wind, watching over his family and his swamp. We visit him every year. The locals say the swamp has changed, that it protects people now instead of hurting them. Sometimes when Jane touches the water, her hands glow blue, and she smiles like she's talking to her brother. As for me, I've learned that family bonds are stronger than any evil, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of someone you love so they can become who they're meant to be. The swamp is John's home now, and in a way, he's become the guardian his father once was, watching over these waters, keeping the darkness at bay. My brave, beautiful boy, forever part of the bayou's magic. My name is Michael Blackwood, and what I am about to tell you happened to me back in 1977 when I was 16. Even today, at the age of 64, my hands shake as I write this down. Some nights, when the moon is full, I still wake up in cold sweat, remembering what happened in those mountains. I had a twin brother, James. We looked exactly alike, same brown hair, same green eyes, same height. But that's where the similarities ended. James was the loud one, always getting into fights and trouble at school. I was quieter, preferring to read books and keep to myself. Our family wasn't doing so great that year. Dad, Richard Blackwood, had lost his job at the bank 6 months ago. He'd started drinking more and more. Mom, Linda, tried her best to keep us all together, always wearing that forced smile of hers. But we all knew things were falling apart. For our 16th birthday, Mom convinced Dad to take us camping in the Ozark Mountains. She thought it would help us become a family again. We had just bought this old Winnebago RV. Well, more like Dad spent a chunk of his severance pay on it. It was kind of beat up, but Mom said it had character. Our German Shepherd Rex was coming too. He'd been acting weird lately, barking at nothing and refusing to sleep at night. I remember that morning so clearly. It was early October, leaves turning golden and red. The air was crisp, and there was this feeling. I can't explain it, but something felt off right from the start. Rex wouldn't get into the RV at first, just stood there whining. James called him a stupid mutt and pulled him in. If only we had listened to Rex that day. If only we had turned around when that creepy gas station guy warned us about Devil's Holler. But we didn't. And what happened next? Well, it changed everything. Some of us didn't make it back. And those of us who did, we were never the same again. Do you want to hear what happened? I should warn you, this isn't a happy camping story. This is about something ancient and evil in those mountains, something that's still out there, waiting. And every full moon, when I feel the change is starting, I am reminded that a part of it is now inside me too. Let me tell you about the most terrifying 3 days of my life, about the creatures we encountered, and about how I lost my family in Devil's Holler. The drive to the Ozarks started normally enough. Dad was behind the wheel, trying to stay focused on the winding mountain roads. Mom sat next to him with the map, though I noticed her hands were shaking a bit. I could smell the coffee from Dad's thermos, and something else too, probably the whiskey he thought we didn't know about. James and I were in the back of the RV with Rex. The old Winnebago creaked with every turn, and the radio kept cutting in and out. At first, we thought it was just bad reception in the mountains. But then we started hearing something weird through the static, like people chanting in a language I'd never heard before. "Did you hear that?" I asked James. "It's just interference," he said, but I could tell he was spooked too. Rex certainly didn't like it. His ears were perked up, and he kept moving from window to window, whining softly. Around 4 p.m., we needed gas. Dad pulled into this old station, the kind with rusty pumps and a wooden store that looked like it might fall over any minute. The old man who worked there had this strange look in his eyes when we told him we were heading to Devil's Holler campground. "Folks don't go there much anymore," he said, his voice all scratchy. "Not since the Miller family disappeared in '75. Their campsite was found torn apart, like something big had ripped through it. Never found any bodies, though." Mom tried to laugh it off. "Oh, probably just some bears, right?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Ain't no bears that can tear through metal like paper, ma'am. Ain't no bears that walk on 2 legs neither." I saw Dad roll his eyes, but he was gripping the steering wheel tighter when we left. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when we started noticing the symbols, weird marks carved into some of the tree trunks. They looked old, but somehow the cuts seemed fresh, like they were still bleeding sap. Rex started growling. Not his usual protective bark, but a low, frightened sound I'd never heard him make before. James wasn't making jokes anymore either. He just stared out the window, watching the trees get thicker and darker as we drove deeper into the mountains. The worst part was the silence. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No bird sounds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the rumble of our RV's engine and Rex's occasional whimper. "Maybe we should find another campground," Mom suggested quietly. "We've already come this far," Dad said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. "It'll be dark soon. We should just set up camp. And..." He never finished that sentence because right then we heard it. A howl that didn't sound like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost human-like, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rex started barking frantically, and even James grabbed my arm. We all knew right then that coming here was a terrible mistake. But by that point, it was already too late to turn back. We finally reached Devil's Holler campground just as the sun was setting. The place looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years. Dead leaves covered the ground, and the few picnic tables were rotting away. There was only one other campsite with an old tent, but no one seemed to be around. Dad parked our RV near a clearing, trying to act normal. "See? Nothing to worry about. Just a regular campground," he said, but his hands were shaking as he turned off the engine. The moment we stepped outside, the cold hit us. It was way colder than it should have been for October. Mom started making hot dogs for dinner, probably hoping that food would calm everyone down. James and I were supposed to collect firewood, but Rex wouldn't let us go more than a few feet from the RV. He kept placing himself between us and the trees, showing his teeth at shadows. That's when I saw it, the first real sign that something was terribly wrong. On a tree just at the edge of our campsite's light, there was this symbol carved deep into the bark. It looked fresh, with sap still oozing out. But the weird thing was, the sap was dark red, almost like blood. "James, look at this," I whispered. But when I turned around, James was staring at something else. About 50 feet away, between the trees, there was a paper fluttering in the wind. We walked over to it, and my stomach turned. It was a missing person poster from 1973, the photo all faded and yellow. Right next to it was another one from 1968, and another from 1975. "Boys, dinner's ready," Mom called out. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet forest. We ran back to the RV, but didn't tell Mom and Dad about the posters. They were worried enough already. We could hear Dad taking long drinks from his special thermos, and Mom's hands trembled as she passed out paper plates. Night fell fast in the mountains. The darkness seemed to press in around our campfire, making the shadows dance in weird ways. Rex refused to eat his food, keeping his eyes fixed on the tree line. Then we heard it again, that horrible howl, closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the light of our fire. Rex started growling, his fur standing straight up. "It's just wolves," Dad said, but he was gripping his chair so hard his knuckles were white. "Wolves don't sound like that," James whispered. "And wolves don't." He stopped mid-sentence, because right then, we all saw it. 2 yellow eyes, glowing in the darkness, about 8 feet off the ground. They were watching us. And they looked intelligent, human-like. The worst part? Those eyes blinked, and then we saw more pairs of eyes appearing in the darkness around us. We were surrounded. Mom grabbed both James and me, pulling us toward the RV. "Richard," she said quietly to Dad, "get inside. Now." But before we could move, we heard something that made my blood freeze. A deep, growling voice from the darkness. "Welcome to Devil's Holler Blackwoods." Everything happened so fast after that. Dad yelled at us to run while he grabbed the camping axe. Mom practically pushed us into the RV, with Rex jumping in right behind us. I could hear these heavy footsteps circling our vehicle, not like animal paws, but more like someone walking on 2 legs. Through the RV windows, we finally saw them clearly in our outdoor lights. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Imagine wolves standing upright like humans, but massive, easily 8 feet tall. Their fur was dark as night, and those yellow eyes seemed to glow from within. But the scariest part was how they moved. Not like animals at all, but with purpose, like they were thinking and planning. One of them was bigger than the others. It had silver fur streaked with black, and its eyes weren't yellow but a deep, burning red. This had to be their leader, the Alpha that the old cave paintings would later warn us about. "Get away from my family!" Dad shouted from outside. He was swinging the axe, trying to look brave, but his voice was shaking. The Alpha spoke again, its voice like gravel being crushed. "Your kind has been warned for generations to stay away from these hills." Mom was trying to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. James was frozen by the window, staring at the creatures. But Rex, poor Rex, was going crazy, barking and throwing himself against the RV door, trying to get out to help Dad. "Michael, hold Rex!" Mom screamed, still fighting with the engine. But Rex was too strong. He managed to push past James and burst through the door. We watched in horror as he charged at the nearest dogman, all his protective instincts taking over. What happened next? I still have nightmares about it. The Alpha didn't even move. It just looked at Rex. And suddenly our brave dog stopped mid-run. He started whimpering, his tail between his legs. Then he turned around, but it wasn't Rex anymore. His eyes had turned yellow, just like theirs. "Rex?" James called out softly. "Here, boy." Rex looked at us one last time, and I swear I saw tears in his eyes. Then he turned and walked into the darkness with the dogmen, disappearing between the trees. Dad used this moment to run back to the RV, slamming the door behind him. The engine finally started, and Mom hit the gas. As we reversed out of the campsite, I saw the Alpha watching us through the rear window. It wasn't trying to stop us. Instead, it smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth, as if it knew something we didn't. "They're letting us leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. James nodded. "Because they know we'll be back." He was right. This was just the beginning of our nightmare at Devil's Holler. We had no idea then that losing Rex was only the first part of their plan, or that by sunrise, we'd find him again in a way that would haunt us forever. Mom drove through the darkness, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Dad kept looking back through the windows. But the dogmen weren't following us. They didn't need to. Somehow, we all knew we weren't really getting away. And there was something else. Something none of us had noticed yet. James had started scratching his arm where one of the dogmen had briefly touched him during the chaos. It was just a small scratch then, but it would soon change everything. We drove for about 20 minutes before the RV started making weird noises. Mom had no choice but to pull over on a narrow stretch of mountain road. That's when we realized we were actually driving deeper into Devil's Holler, not out of it. Somehow, every turn we took led us back to the same area. "The gas station," Mom said, trying to stay calm. "We need to get back to the main road and find that gas station." Dad was sitting with his head in his hands. "Those things, they weren't natural. Did you see how they—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. James was getting worse. The scratch on his arm had turned an ugly purple color, and he kept shivering even though the RV's heater was on full blast. "I don't feel so good," he mumbled. That's when we heard it, Rex's bark. But it wasn't his normal friendly bark. It sounded wrong, twisted somehow. "Don't look," Dad warned. But we all did anyway. There, hanging from a tree branch just ahead of our headlights, was Rex. But he was wrong. It was like someone had turned him inside out. His fur was on the inside, and everything else was on the outside. I got sick right there in the RV. Mom started crying, and Dad just stared, his face white as a sheet. But James started laughing. Not his normal laugh. This was different, almost like a growl. "Isn't it beautiful?" he said, and his voice didn't sound like him anymore. When he turned to look at me, his eyes had a yellow tinge to them. "James?" I reached for my twin, but Mom pulled me back. "That's not your brother," she whispered. "Not right now." The scratching sound started next, like claws on metal, all around the RV. The dogmen were back, but we couldn't see them in the darkness. The Alpha's voice came through the walls, as if he was standing right next to us. "The boy is mine now. The change has begun." James started convulsing, falling to the RV floor. His fingers were getting longer, and I could hear his bones cracking as they started to reshape themselves. "No!" Mom screamed, trying to hold him. "Not my boy!" Dad suddenly remembered something. "The cave! The gas station man said something about a cave with ancient drawings. Said it might have answers." "We can't go deeper into these woods," Mom protested. But one look at James told us we had no choice. He was changing, and we had to find a way to stop it. Dad took the wheel this time. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, but somehow he found a dirt path leading to what looked like an old mining trail. The scratching sounds followed us, and James's transformation was getting worse. His teeth were growing longer, and fur was starting to sprout on his arms. "Hurry," I begged Dad. "We're losing him." The RV's headlights suddenly caught something, a dark opening in the mountain ahead, the cave. But as we got closer, we could see more symbols carved around its entrance, glowing faintly in the dark. And there, written in what looked like fresh blood, was a message. "Enter and face your fears. Leave and lose your soul. We had found the cave, but something told me we were walking right into their trap. The problem was, we had no other choice. James was almost gone, and those things were closing in around us. We had to go in. What we found in that cave would change everything, if we survived long enough to understand it. Dad parked the RV near the cave entrance. James was getting worse. His face was starting to change shape, and he kept making these horrible growling sounds. Mom stayed with him while Dad and I grabbed flashlights to check out the cave. "Stay close," Dad whispered, his hand shaking as he pointed his flashlight into the darkness. The beam showed drawings on the cave walls, hundreds of them, all telling some kind of story. The first drawings showed normal wolves, then people, and then something in between, the dogmen. There were pictures of ceremonies where people were being transformed, and others showing the alpha figure with its red eyes controlling both humans and wolves. "Look at this," I said, pointing to some writing scratched into the rock. It wasn't in English, but somehow I could understand it. It was like the words were speaking directly to my mind. "The guardians of Devil's Holler will punish those who trespass. One will be taken, one will be changed, one will be sacrificed, and one will carry the curse." A scream from outside made us jump. "Linda!" Dad yelled, running back toward the cave entrance. I followed right behind him, my heart pounding. We found Mom on the RV floor, backing away from James. My twin brother wasn't human anymore. His face had stretched into a wolf-like muzzle, and his hands had become claws. But his eyes were the worst part. They were glowing yellow, just like the dogmen's. "James, please," Mom begged. "Fight it." James spoke, but his voice was mixed with growls. "James isn't here anymore, Mother." He lunged forward, and everything happened so fast after that. Dad tried to grab him, but James was too strong now. He threw Dad against the RV wall like he was nothing. Mom tried to reach for James one last time, still believing she could save her son. That's when he. I can't write this part without crying, even now. James, he killed her. Right there in front of us, his own mother. Dad screamed and pulled out something I hadn't seen before, a silver knife. "The gas station man," he said, his voice breaking. "He gave this to me, said it was blessed by native shamans." The Alpha's voice boomed through the RV. "The sacrifice has been made. Now the change will be complete." Dad looked at me, tears in his eyes. "Run, Michael. Run as far as you can." "But Dad..." "Run!" I ran out of the RV just as the dogman started tearing through its metal walls like it was paper. The last thing I saw was Dad charging at the Alpha with the silver knife, while James, or what used to be James, howled into the night. I ran through the darkness, branches cutting my face, roots trying to trip me. Behind me, I could hear fighting, screaming, and then silence. The kind of silence that tells you everyone you love is gone. But the worst part? As I ran, I felt something changing inside me too. Every time my heart beat, I could feel the curse spreading through my blood. I had touched James during the fight, and now every full moon I feel it. The change, the curse. I am the one who lived to carry it, just like the cave drawings predicted. One taken, Rex, one changed. James, one sacrificed, Mom, and one cursed me. Dad? We never found his body. Some say he died fighting the Alpha. Others say he's still out there, hunting the dogmen with his silver knife. All I know is that Devil's Holler claimed my family that night, and it's still claiming others. So if you are ever driving through the Ozarks and you see signs for Devil's Holler, turn around. Turn around before it's too late, because they're still out there waiting. And sometimes, on full moon nights, if you listen carefully, you might hear a howl that sounds almost human. That's probably me, fighting the change once again, remembering the night I lost everything to the howl of the Ozarks. I found my way back to civilization the next morning. When I stumbled into the same gas station where our nightmare began, the old man just nodded, like he'd been expecting me. He didn't seem surprised when I told him I was the only one who made it out. "You've got the mark now, son," he said quietly, pointing to a small scratch on my arm I hadn't noticed before. It was shaped like one of those symbols from the cave. "It'll start with the dreams. Then the changes will come with each full moon." He was right. That first full moon was horrible. I locked myself in a basement, feeling my bones crack and reshape. But unlike James, I could fight it. Maybe because I wasn't directly chosen by the Alpha, or maybe because I had Dad's strength in me. I never fully transform, but I am not fully human anymore either. I tried telling the police about what happened. They searched Devil's Holler but found nothing. No RV, no bodies, not even the cave with the drawings. Just empty woods and normal animal tracks. They wrote it off as a tragic camping accident, probably bears or wolves. Missing persons reports were filed for my family, joining all the others from Devil's Holler. But here is the really creepy part. Every year on the anniversary of that night, I get a package. Inside is always something that belonged to my family: Mom's wedding ring, James's baseball cap, Dad's watch. Last year, I got Dad's silver knife, covered in dried black blood. With it was a note in rough handwriting. "Still fighting, son. Stay strong, Dad." I've tried tracking down more information about Devil's Holler over the years. I found old newspapers telling similar stories, going back to the 1800s. Always the same pattern: families vanishing. One survivor left to tell the tale. Some of these survivors reported seeing their transformed loved ones running with the pack years later. Sometimes, on full moon nights, I drive up to the edge of those mountains. I can hear them howling in the distance. And sometimes, I swear I hear a howl that sounds like James calling me to join them. But I resist. I have to. Last month, I saw a family in an RV at that same gas station, asking for directions to Devil's Holler. I told them what happened to my family. The father laughed it off, just like my dad did. But I could see their young daughter hugging their dog tighter, looking scared. They drove off toward the mountains anyway. 3 days later, only the daughter came back. She had the same mark on her arm that I have. So I took her in. I am teaching her how to control the changes, how to stay human, because that's all we can do now: help others and warn those who listen. The dogmen are still out there, still hunting, still changing people. And somewhere in those mountains, my brother James runs with them, while my dad hunts them with his silver knife. As for me, I've learned to live with what I am. But every time I hear about a family heading toward Devil's Holler, my heart breaks. Because I know exactly what's waiting for them in those dark mountains. Remember this story, share it, and if you are ever in the Ozarks and see those carved symbols on the trees, turn back, just turn back. Because not everyone is strong enough to fight the change. Not everyone survives to tell their tale. And the Alpha is always watching, always waiting for new families to claim.